in November of 2018, a Chinese scientist named He Jiankui achieved global notoriety by announcing that he had used a relatively new gene editing technique on human embryos, which led to the birth of the world's first gene-edited babies. His ambition was to help people with HIV-related fertility problems, one of which is that if a parent is HIV positive, there's a chance they could transmit HIV to their child. This genetic modification was meant to confer immunity to HIV to the children, so that wouldn't be an issue. And in order to accomplish that immunity, He used a technology called CRISPR-Cas9 to modify the embryo's DNA to remove their CCR5 gene, which is related to immune system function, but relevant to this undertaking, also serves as a common pathway for the HIV-1 virus, allowing it to infect a new host. CRISPR is an acronym that stands for Clustered Regularly Interspaced Short Palindromic Repeats, and that refers to a type of DNA sequence found in all sorts of genomes, including about half of all sequenced bacterial genomes and just shy of 90% of all sequenced archaea genomes. Cas9 stands for CRISPR-associated protein 9, which is an enzyme that uses CRISPR sequences, those repeating common sequences in DNA strands, to open up targeted strands. And when paired with specific CRISPR sequences, this duo can search for selected patterns in DNA and then edit those patterns. This tool then allows researchers who know the DNA pattern representing a particular genetic trait, a trait that moderates an immune system protein that also happens to serve as a convenient pathway for HIV, for instance, to alter or eliminate that trait. A shorthand and very incomplete way of thinking about this tool is a sort of a find and replace function, like you have in a text document in your computer. And in this instance, the gene sequence being replaced is a DNA strand that causes a trait that in turn leads to HIV susceptibility. So that's what He targeted in those embryos. And the children those embryos eventually became were usually referred to as Lulu and Nana, which are pseudonyms for their privacy. They were the first gene-edited babies. Though because of the gene editing state of the art at the time, still pretty new, while He intended to render these babies' CCR5 genes entirely non-functional, which would replicate a natural mutation that has been noted in some non-gene edited people, it just happened naturally to them, including the so-called Berlin patient, who was a patient in Germany in the late 90s who was functionally cured of HIV, the first known person to be thus cured. While that is what He intended to do, instead these two babies actually carry both a functional and a mutant, a changed copy of CCR5, not just the changed one, which in theory means they're not actually immune to HIV as intended. Regardless of that outcome, which may be less impactful than He and other proponents of this technology may have hoped, He achieved superstardom briefly, even being named one of the most influential people in the world by Time magazine in 2019. But he was also crushed by controversy, stripped of his license to conduct medical research by the Chinese government, called a mad scientist, sent to prison for 3 years and fined 3 million yuan, which is more than $400,000, and generally outcast from the global scientific community for his ethical violations. Mostly because the type of gene editing he did to these embryos was not a one-off sort of thing. It was what's called germ line editing, which means those changes he made won't just impact Lulu and Nana, they will be passed on to their children as well, and their children's children, and so on. And the ethical implications of germ line editing are so much more substantial, because while a one-off error would be devastating to the person who suffers it, such an error that is passed on to potentially endless future generations could conceivably, at the far end of the oh no spectrum, end humanity. The error doesn't even have to be a botched job. It could be an edit that makes the edited child taller or more intelligent by some measure, or more resistant to a disease like HIV. But because this is a fringy science and we don't fully understand how changing one thing might change other things, the implications for such edits are massive. Giving someone an immunity to HIV would theoretically be a good thing then, but if that edit then went on the market and became common, we might see a generation of humans that are immune to HIV but potentially more susceptible to something else. Or maybe who live shorter lives, or maybe who create a subsequent generation who themselves are prone to all sorts of issues that we could not possibly have foreseen because we made these edits without first mapping all possible implications of making that genetic tweak. And we did so in such a way that those edits would persist throughout the generations. What I'd like to talk about today is another example of a similar technology, but one that's distinct enough and which carries substantially less long-term risk that it's being greeted primarily with celebration rather than concern. You're listening to Let's Know Things. I'm Colin Wright. I'm able to keep this show ad-free because of support from listeners like you. If you're finding value in what I'm doing here, consider becoming a paid supporter for the cost of a cup of coffee each month at letsknowthings.com. And as a thank you for your helping me keep this show solvent, you'll receive an additional bonus More Things episode each month. All right, let's get back to the show. In early August of 2024, a gene editing researcher at the University of Pennsylvania, Dr. Kiran Musunuru, was asked if there was anything he could do to help a baby that was being treated at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia for CPS1 deficiency, which manifests as an inability to get rid of the ammonia that builds up in one's body as a byproduct of protein metabolism. So we all generate a small amount of ammonia just as a function of processing the protein that we consume. And this deficiency kept the baby from processing and discarding that ammonia in the usual fashion. And as a result, ammonia was building up in its blood and crossing into its brain. The usual method of dealing with this deficiency is severely restricting the sufferer's protein intake so that less ammonia is generated, while also taking some medication to help process the ammonia. But being a baby, that restriction meant it wasn't able to grow. He was getting just enough protein to survive and was in the 7th percentile for body weight. So a doctor at the Children's Hospital wanted to see if there was anything this gene editing researcher could do to help this baby who was at risk of severe brain damage or death because of this condition that he was born with. Now, gene editing is still a very new technology, and CRISPR and associated technologies are even newer, still often resulting in inaccurate edits, many of which eventually go away, but that also means the intended edit sometimes goes away over time too. The body's processes eventually replacing the edited genetic code with the original. That said, these researchers, working with other researchers at institutions around the world, though mostly in the United States, were able to rush a usually very cumbersome and time-consuming process that would typically take nearly a decade, and came up with and tested a gene editing approach custom-tailored to this baby to target the specific mutation that was causing its problems. And they did it in record time. The original email asking if Dr. Musunuru might be able to help arrived in August of 2024. And in late February of 2025, the baby received his first infusion of the substance that would make the proper edits to his genes. They divided the full intended treatment into 3 doses, the first being very, very small because they didn't know how the baby would respond to it, and they wanted to be very, very cautious. There were positive signs after that first infusion within the first few weeks. So 22 days later, they administered the second dose, and the third followed after that. Now, the research and medical worlds are waiting to see if the treatment sticks. The baby is already up to the 40th percentile in terms of weight for his age, is able to eat a lot more protein, and is taking far less medication to help him deal with ammonia buildup. All good signs. But there's a chance that he may still need a liver transplant, which is common for people who are born with this mutation, that there might be unforeseen consequences due to that intended edit or other accidental edits made by the treatment. Or, again, that even if it works for a while, the edits might not stick, as has been the case in some previous trials of similar tools. Already, this is being heralded as a big success, though, as the treatment seems to be at least partially successful, has not triggered any serious negative consequences, and has stuck around for a while. So even if further treatments are needed to keep the gene edited, to make it stick, there's a chance this could lead to better and better gene editing treatments in the future, or that such treatments could replace wholesale some medications, or be used for conditions that do not have reliable medications in the first place. This is also the first known case of a human of any age being given a custom gene editing treatment, one that's made especially for them rather than one that's being made to broadly serve any patient with a given ailment or condition. And in some circles, that is considered to be the future of this field, as individually tailored gene treatments could help folks deal with chronic illnesses and genetic conditions like cystic fibrosis, Huntington's disease, muscular dystrophy, and sickle cell, but also possibly help fight cancers and similar issues. More immediately, if this treatment is shown to be long-term efficacious for this first baby patient, it could be applied to other people who suffer the same deficiency, which afflicts an estimated 1 in 1.3 million people globally. So it's not common. Both parents have to have a mutant copy of a specific gene for their child to have this condition. But that is another reason this type of treatment is considered to be promising. Many conditions are not widespread enough to justify investment in pharmaceuticals or other medical interventions that would help them. So custom-tailored gene editing tools could be used instead on a case-by-case basis. This is especially true if the speed at which a customized treatment can be developed is sped up even further, though there are concerns about the future of this field and researchers' ability to up its efficiency further, as, at least in the United States, the current administration's gutting of federal research bodies and funding looks likely to hit this field hard. And previous similar victories that involved dramatically truncating otherwise ponderous developmental processes, like the historically rapid development of early COVID-19 vaccines, are not looked at favorably by a large portion of the US electorate, which could mean those in charge of allocating resources and clearing the legal way for such research might instead pull even more funding and put more roadblocks in place, hobbling those future efforts rather than the opposite. There are plenty of other researchers and institutions working on similar things around the world, of course, but this particular wing of that larger field may have higher hurdles to leap to get anything done in the coming years if current trends continue. Again, though, however that larger context evolves, we are still in the early days of this, and there is a chance that this approach will turn out to be non-ideal for all sorts of reasons. The concept of tailored gene editing therapies is an appealing one, though, as it could replace many existing pharmaceutical, surgical, and similar approaches to dealing with chronic inherited conditions in particular, and because it could, in theory at least, allow us to address such issues rapidly, and without needing to mess around with the germ line, because mutations could be assessed and addressed on a person-by-person basis, those edits staying within their individual bodies and not being passed on to their offspring, rather than attempting to make genetic customizations for all future generations based on the imperfect knowledge and know-how of today's science and the biased standards and priorities of today's cultural context. The book I'd like to recommend today is called The Siren's Call: How Attention Became the World's Most Endangered Resource by Christopher Hayes. This is a book that's written by a guy who I think is a bit of a celebrity. I'm not super aware of his other work. He's some kind of news commentator, I believe. The book itself is pretty good, though. It's not going to be entirely new if you've already been keeping up with the commentary and writing and research related to things like smartphones and the internet and social media and the way all of these things grab our attention and, to a certain degree at least, and at least allegedly, manipulate us and occupy all of our time and attention in increasingly sophisticated ways. If you are keeping up with any of that, most of this will not be new, but it is written in such a way that it makes some of those concepts more memorable, which can make them closer at hand. And as somebody who is keeping up with that stuff, I still found it to be a very valuable read because of the way it's written and because of the way it tackles these topics and how it aggregates that most recent data and puts it into a more intelligible and intuitive format. Now, if any of that sounds interesting to you, consider picking up a copy of The Siren's Call by Christopher Hayes. Let's Know Things is a listener-supported show. I don't make any money from ads, only what listeners contribute by becoming paid supporters at letsknowthings.com. If you're not in the position to become a paid supporter at the moment, consider leaving a quick review wherever you get your pods. Those help get the show in front of more people and lend a hint of credibility to independently made shows like this one. A huge thanks in advance, whatever shape your support might take.